morning, and this afternoon of the role of livestock system to preserve biodiversity. These are two big challenges. And when WAAP decided to select these two topics, we chose a room of 300 seats. And 1 month and a half ago, we received 450 inscriptions. This explains that we are in this large auditorium, and also it explains that these are big questions of the moment. I am very happy to have such participation. And I would like to thank you all for coming. Of course, we were obliged to change the auditorium, and unfortunately, we were obliged also to leave the coffee break, lunchroom, and welcome cocktail of this evening at the complete opposite of the conference palace. So I will explain you that we will need some organization to go there and to come back here after. This session is also available on streaming, and we have some people following us by streaming at the moment. So I would like to thank the speakers and the chairperson for accepting to come, for accepting our invitation. I would like also to thank our sponsors. We'll have 2 sponsors today. The sponsors are essential to some equilibrium, financial equilibrium of the conference. But also they are very important in terms of help that they can give to scientists or to professionals for development of their programs. We will see that in the near future. So we also have the French Academy of Agriculture, which is one of our associated partners today for the whole day. So this morning and afternoon, and this afternoon, each session is organized on the same scheme. We will have a presentation of the sponsors. This morning, this will be CLOC, the American company who is manufacturing green feed apparatus that many of you know and maybe use. And this afternoon, it will be Sommet de l'Élevage, which is an organization which organized an agricultural show in October this year. So after that, we will have a sequence of a speech. Each speech will be followed by a discussion specific to the speech. So we will have 2 presentations of 30 minutes plus 10 minutes of discussion, and then after, a presentation of 15 minutes plus 5 minutes of discussion. And at the end of the day, we will have a general discussion, so from 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. We will have a general discussion for both sessions, greenhouse gas emission and biodiversity. So please prepare your questions. You will have to move to the 2 microphones here to ask questions. So prepare your questions in advance and prepare to move. So before starting the session of greenhouse gas emission, I want to say 3 important points, 4 important points in fact. The first one is that this week, even though this day is only WAAP, this week we will have each morning and each afternoon joint sessions between WAAP and EAAP. They are also available on streaming, so you can see in the program that you have interesting and global items for these sessions. Secondly, Monday afternoon, that is tomorrow afternoon, please come to the welcome and award ceremony, which is joint also with EAAP, to hear the awardees of WAAP and to watch at other sponsors that support the conference. And third, Tuesday morning, please come to the EAAP WAAP plenary session to hear the EAAP and WAAP award lectures. WAAP give an award to a scientist who will give to EAAP give an award to a scientist. We will give a lecture, and we'll give awards also to other WAAP awardee. So before, the last point that I want to mention is this question of moving from this room to the coffee break room to lunch room and to welcome ceremony, which will welcome cocktail, excuse me, which will take place immediately after the end of the session from 6 to 7. So we are, excuse me. We are here at level -1 in Auditorium Lumière, and coffee break, lunch, and welcome cocktail are here at level +1. We have to move this long way here to come where the registration is and to go upstairs to level 1 in TED door rooms. It takes about 7 minutes to go there. So I am happy to contribute to your health by doing that, but I apologize also for that. So before giving the floor to Anne Mottet here and Jean-Louis Peyraud here, who are the two co-chairs of this session, I will open by a CLOC presentation, so which is our sponsor for this morning. CLOC is a US company who is claiming to be the global leader in ruminant emission data collection. And if we watch at their
invented and produced by PhD scientists and engineers with years of experience in trace gas measurements, the GreenFeed is a patented, validated, standardized, and world-renowned tool to measure metabolic gas emissions from ruminant animals. It allows users to quantitatively measure individual animal mass fluxes of methane, carbon dioxide, and hydrogen emissions, as well as oxygen uptake accurately in both research and production environments. This turnkey system is easy to use, which allows our users with all different levels of experience to make accurate and standardized measurements worldwide in almost any application, whether it be in tie stalls, free stalls, on pasture, or in dairy systems. It has been used in over 40 countries, has measured emissions from hundreds of thousands of animals, and is backed by over 250 scientific publications. GreenFeed's operating method is completely unique and was invented, tested, and patented by CLOC Incorporated. To measure individual animal fluxes, each animal needs to have RFID identification. When the animal approaches the GreenFeed system, the feed is dropped at a controlled rate into the feed tray to entice the animal to keep its head in the tray for 3 to 5 minutes. While the animals are visiting, the GreenFeed collects the emitted gases and quantitatively measures the mass flow rate of methane, carbon dioxide, hydrogen, and oxygen emitted by the animal. Data is also automatically filtered to remove periods when the animal's head is not inside the machine and there is unacceptable dilution. When the animal is done, the next animal can begin the process again, which allows the user to measure emissions from as many as 20 to 40 animals per day. This process does not have a significant impact on animal behavior and can be operated continuously in production environments. Through research, it has been demonstrated that if these measurements are repeated 2 to 4 times per day for a period of 1 to 2 weeks, the spot measurements produce accurate averaged emissions for individuals and for the herd. Peer-reviewed research has shown that GreenFeed produces more universally compatible, standardized, and accurate emissions measurements than any other method. GreenFeed uses a strict calibration protocol, where calibration gases are validated and tested at CLOC Incorporated against a universal standard to ensure accuracy between users. In-field calibrations are completed and analyzed on a specific schedule to ensure accuracy of all operating machines. This worldwide universal calibration ensures the standardization of results from all GreenFeed users. GreenFeed seamlessly and securely transmits data to a cloud-based server using a Wi-Fi internet connection. If Wi-Fi is not available, the included cellular modem can be used to wirelessly transmit data. Users can access and analyze the data from anywhere in the world using our secure web-based portal. There are no requirements for extra software or computers to maintain the GreenFeed data. Our secure backed-up database is operated by Amazon Web Services, which means the highest level of security and reliability. If there are problems with unit performance, they are spotted by the CLOC support team long before the user notices and is quickly addressed to minimize unit downtime, data loss. GreenFeed has many options and can be operated in commercial dairy farms, feedlots, research-free stalls, goats or sheep productions, on weaned calves and cattle breeds from any region. The measurement of methane and carbon dioxide fluxes is standard in all units. Users can also choose to add oxygen and hydrogen gas sensors. The oxygen sensor is ideal for users who want to measure both carbon dioxide and oxygen to determine energy balances for the animals. Hydrogen sensors are ideal for measuring the effectiveness of certain methane inhibitor products that channel hydrogen into hydrogen gas instead of into methane. GreenFeed is used for many different scientific studies. A common use is for measuring the effectiveness of feed additives, dietary measures, and management strategies meant to decrease methane emissions. The GreenFeed system can be configured for extra large or small ruminant animals. A few options include a dual hopper system that will allow users to feed 2 different types of feed as specified to unique animals. Wind sensors for outdoor use, a cold weather kit for use in below freezing environments, and extra web cameras. Join the growing list of satisfied users with GreenFeed. Invented and produced.
So, thank you very much. So I now give the floor to Anne Mottet and Jean-Louis for this first session of control of greenhouse gas emissions in ruminant farming. Please, Anne and Jean-Louis. Thank you.
Thank you, Philippe. So we are very pleased, Anne and me, to chair this first session dedicated to the mitigation of methane emission of ruminants. As Philippe said, we are very happy indeed to have such a large audience in this big room, even if the room is quite far from the coffee break room. Obviously, GHG emissions are an important issue for livestock farming, especially for ruminants. Indeed, too often we consider that the discourse is very simplistic about ruminants. They are just a producer of methane, and the best way to reduce methane emission is to reduce the number of ruminants. This vision is not wrong for sure, but it just forgets that another way is to reduce the intensity of emission. This is the case in many papers dedicated to simulation, development of more sustainable food chain. And indeed, they often forget that we can reduce intensity of emission. And this morning, we will consider that ruminants are really an extraordinary animals which are able to use cellulose, we cannot digest cellulose, to produce high quality food, namely meat, milk. And for sure, the digestion of cellulose produce some methane, and due to the microbiota in the rumen. So obviously the price to pay is a short emission of methane because we are a digestion of cellulose. It is a natural process, but it is our responsibility to optimize this natural process, and it is what we will see this morning.
Yes, good morning. So my name is Anne Mottet. Jean-Louis Peyraud, could you tell us where you work actually?
Yes, I am a researcher at INRA. I work at the Scientific Direction of Agriculture on livestock in general, for research on livestock in general. And you, Anne?
And I work at the International Fund for Agricultural Development, which is a specialized agency of the United Nations. And before that, some of you know that I was working at FAO. So this morning we will focus on two aspects when it comes to emissions. First, quantifying emissions, quantifying in terms of measurements, and we saw, for example, the CLOC system, but we heard about other systems, and also identifying options to reduce them. And both topics are still, if you ask us, a very hot topic and a priority for research. But they are very closely linked. We usually say that we cannot improve what we don't measure, but I think we should not wait for the ultimate measurement to start improving. And this is what we're doing today. So we will see in these presentations that there are many possibilities for reducing the intensity of emission, but also absolute emission in some cases, and that the scope for progress is quite different between different regions and different systems. And we will also see that the most effective path of progress are different, but the scope remains very important at global level. So to tackle these issues, we have two long presentations to start with, 30 minutes each, followed by 4 shorter presentations, focusing on different areas of mitigation. And back to you, Jean-Louis, for introducing the first speaker.
Okay, thanks. So the first speaker is Kris Johnson, who is a professor of animal science at Washington State University. His field of research is really rumen nutrition, with a special focus on beef and to some extent on dairy. Mitigation of methane is a key issue in his research activity. Her presentation will deal with the real place of livestock in greenhouse gas emission and their control for climate change. So Kristen, the floor is yours. You have 30 minutes, then we will have 10-minute discussion.
All right, thank you very much. And thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. As I looked at the program as to who's speaking after me, I thought it was pretty good to be first. Because it's a really excellent program, and I encourage you to come back after the long coffee break walk. So my goal this morning is to talk about some critical areas that need to be addressed as people throw around the idea that perhaps ruminant animals need to go away, or at least the population needs to be decreased. And I would postulate that there's a bunch of information that needs to be taken into consideration before decisions like that are taken. So if we just quickly back up a little bit and discuss the roles of livestock across the world, it's fairly clear that we would all remember animal source products, milk, meat, and those things, and the nutritional importance of those. But if you look even deeper, there's cultural issues that are associated with livestock and livestock production, and those include things, economic status, use in households, social status, and leisure activities. And so it's kind of maybe a first world or a wealthy country idea that, you know, livestock should disappear when we're not really taking into consideration what others may use livestock for and how important that is. So if you just dig a little deeper to the role, and this was 2022 data, the role of livestock in general across the world generates about 40% of global agricultural GDP, 33% of global protein, 17% of calories. It's a substantial employer across the world and a major provider of food security, and income in developing countries. And the demand for livestock products is growing. So within this, if you even look at just the beef sector in the EU, 22% of the dietary energy and 50% of protein consumption are provided by livestock products. A non-insignificant 130 billion euros to the economy. Granted, agriculture is about 10.3% of global global emissions, and we've just talked about the importance of finding ways to reduce that. We're going to hear a number of really good talks later about how that can happen. You know, jobs for 4 million people, as well as indirectly 30 million people. I would argue that is a large portion of the EU alone, and certainly merits a lot of consideration before policy decisions are taken into consideration. Additionally, at least according to the EEA, agricultural emissions, at least in the EU, have remained stable since 2005. So while there's room to make progress, things have not gone the other direction. Cheng et al. In 2022 used GLEAM data to demonstrate where emissions come from. And as you would have all expect, cattle are the primary source, followed perhaps by buffalo, pigs, chicken, et cetera. And if you dig down deeper, most of that is associated with methane production, and that would be enteric methane production and emissions of nitrous oxide, or methane production from manure as well as enteric, and then N2O from deposited manure and fertilizer, and then finally CO2 from feed generation, land use changes in energy, et cetera. So with this kind of context in mind, it allows us to sort of think through where those kinds of changes could take place. So reductions in emissions, and we're going to hear really good people talk about this, but you know, the reductions in animal numbers has been thrown around and is showing up increasingly in the press. And then we've known for years that if we change feed digestibility, we can alter methane emissions, feed additives. People are coming up with really creative and new feed additives. And improvement of productivity is also always listed as a possibility, and certainly one we should not discount. But each one of these has trade-offs that are important to consider, and that's kind of what I'd like to talk about today. But before I do, one of the things that, and I'm going to say this is a US-centric opinion because that's where I'm from and where I hear it, but the idea that we can just go ahead and forget ruminants on the planet and I can continue to drive my car where I'm the only one in it, and I can continue to have a large house with air conditioning and everything else, but we just don't need animals on the planet that produce methane, I think is kind of is naive and selfish. And so there is a nice review article I'd encourage you to read where they say CO2 reductions should not be considered as, methane reductions should not be considered as a substitute for CO2 reductions. In other words, blaming ruminants for a pathway that's taken place since they were evolved should not be considered as a substitute for humans changing their behavior. So let's talk briefly a little bit about the roles of livestock and center down a little bit on the food roles. I think this is a place that, again, we can kind of arrogantly think that we can just go ahead and decrease the population without the consideration of what animal source products actually do. This is a couple of graphs from a paper that White and Hall published in 2017, where they took US data and they modeled what would happen if there were no ruminants or no animal source feeds available. So they had the current system, and then they had a system where animal proteins were not available anymore. And they did find that there was a decrease in greenhouse gas emissions, total greenhouse gas emissions. There was a decrease in agricultural greenhouse emissions, not quite as extensive because it required additional fertilizer, et cetera. But what this did to the human diet was increase the energy availability because people switched from animal source proteins to grain source proteins. And actually in this study, they did try to use a balanced diet, perhaps not the diet that most people eat, but a balanced diet, and basically determined that energy intake would go up about, be 11% greater than it needed to be from recommendations. And then all of the lines that do not come up to 1 would be deficient. So you'd see deficiencies in vitamin B, deficiencies in iron, deficiencies in essential fatty acids, and so on and so forth to the diet. Now, clearly in the United States, people could supplement and create supplements, and there's probably the wealth available to find those supplements and to balance these diets, but that's not the case everywhere. This paper was published in 2020, and while the authors are not speculating that meat consumption is directly related to the stunting rate that occurs in some countries, if you look at the black squares are areas in which there's significant maternal malnutrition, which becomes significant child malnutrition. About 150 million people or children are affected, at least as the data comes out for 2020. And as you can see across, as countries increase their meat production or their animal product consumption, that stunting rate goes down. Now again, it's not a cause and effect, and clearly there are other wealth issues associated with this, but it does kind of illustrate effectively, I think, that it's a little naive to just decide that meat consumption, we should just decrease all meat consumption, because we have a pretty strong import-export across the world, and are changing things. We need to consider how that affects others in other countries. Okay, just to kind of reiterate what was said earlier, essentially 46% of livestock's diet is associated with things that we can't eat, and that would be grasses and leaves. Crop residues, fodder crops, oil seeds, byproducts, other non-edible things are all also associated with livestock. And I would argue, and will argue with a little bit of data, that this is not credited towards the livestock sector when LCAs are conducted. So when LCAs are conducted, it might be that the portion of distillers' grains that are fed to livestock are then, that part of the LCA is associated with livestock. Well, what if that livestock weren't there to eat that? And so I'd like to show you a little bit about food waste, which again is a human problem, but I think in some ways becomes an animal solution. So if we look at, it's called upcycling now, or a circular bioeconomy, where feed waste and bioproducts or byproducts are upcycled into animal proteins. And this is essentially the same thing I showed you before, but shows only about 7%, and those are usually the intensified production, use grain that could be used by humans. You got to remember, across the world, it's a much smaller number. And then all of these byproducts are products that are used by livestock and are not necessarily credited to livestock when we start to consider their roles. So food waste, world food waste is significant, 194 to 398 kilograms, and that should be per human per year, not necessarily per head, but I suppose per head works. In the EU, that's estimated to be 158 to 298 kilograms per person per year. That's a fairly large number, and most of this comes from households, from ethanol plants, from food markets, from crops, et cetera. And a lot of that is available for feed for livestock. Other alternatives could include the landfills, composting, and to some extent using them in anaerobic digestion. There's a lot of research that's been done, and primarily most of it has been done in the EU. And those include some solutions to the problem of food waste. And that includes prevention of food waste. That's a human thing for us to decide that we're going to either decrease production or decrease consumption. But then as we move through this hierarchy, we have strong prevention, where people are strongly encouraged, and there's cultural shifts to decrease production and consumption, to decrease waste. Then there's kind of weak prevention, recovery, and that would be using it for human consumption in a different way, and then recycling. And that's primarily where the animals come in, and that's making this food waste available to animals. This particular diagram identifies the three sustainability plateaus. That's environmental, economic, and social, and identifies the places where most of the effort is included. And that would be in the reuse and the composting, optimization, or food banking. And the point here being that each group under each category has their own hierarchy of what they would like to see. So there needs to be some more agreement as to where food waste and how food waste is handled. In 2010, some Korean scientists examined how food disposal waste could be handled. And they looked at, as an LCA, they looked at 4 different methods. One was taking food waste and drying it and then fed to livestock. One was feeding it wet. One was composting it, and one was putting it in a landfill. And all of the data that is below this line would indicate that the footprint is smaller, or the global warming potential is smaller and avoided because it's used in different ways. But the way it's disposed makes a huge difference in terms of its greenhouse gas impact. And you can see that wet feeding, probably because of the energy it took to dry it, was probably the one that was the best, and the worst was using a landfill. The same kind of thing, it was shown in 2016 as well in the review of the literature. But here you can also see that if you add an anaerobic digester, things get to be a little bit less, or they become carbon negative as opposed to carbon positive. But again, you can also see that that's going to be different by area and by the different places in the world where things happen. But you can see for sure that a landfill is not a place to put food waste if we want to decrease the greenhouse gas emissions. So if this were the case then, and animals were not available to feed food waste to, our choices then become either an anaerobic digester or a landfill. And I would argue that the fact that animals exist to be able to use this is a place where, if we examine the true impact of animals, is a place where animals don't receive enough credit. So just to summarize this first part, so reductions on the human side to reduce feed waste are important. I don't mean to diminish that. And there may need to be policy changes associated with that. For example, swill feeding, there's strong reasons that swill feeding has to become appropriate and done correctly so that we don't have outbreaks of disease. However, one place that there can be changes and discussion is discussing how we use food waste. LCAs that credit livestock for using byproducts should actually be considered. It's a significant amount of food waste that goes through livestock, and to just say that, well, that's an opportunity that you have to use it because you raise livestock versus what would happen if there weren't livestock, which is being proposed, I think is important. And as we determine, as we reduce things, the environmental and economic methods by which we deal with waste are really important. So a second area that I would argue that ruminants and other animals deserve some more credit, and that doesn't currently happen, is in ecosystem services. And we're going to hear a lot more about ecosystem services this afternoon, which is great and I think is really important. And so if we look at ecosystem services and we look at how ecosystem services might be credited to ruminants, because if managed appropriately, it would appear that ruminant animals and other livestock can certainly make a contribution. And early on, there were theories of what was called regenerative agriculture, started in about 1986, or at least that's what I found it. I don't mean to insult anybody if it was before that. But in this case, it has to do with increasing sustainability. And there's been a couple of different ways that regenerative agriculture has been discussed. But the idea is that things like minimizing tillage, maintaining soil cover, building soil carbon, sequestering carbon, fostering plant diversity, which will also foster biodiversity, integrating livestock in appropriate ways, avoiding pesticides, and encouraging water use and water conservation are all ways that these kind of regenerative agricultural principles can be used. And these potential effects, positive effects of livestock, again, are important, and they're important to be discussed, and they're important to be quantified. So there's two major schools of thought. One is called sustainable intensification. And this idea is to increase productivity with a lower environmental impact, and that is to use local knowledge about climate and how management works. Theoretically, it should not end up with more land use, and it should not lead to any additional loss of natural ecosystems. I would postulate that this might be the same as, at least in the US, we have climate smart agriculture and climate smart agricultural grants, and I would argue that that is effectively sustainable intensification. The other option, which I think we're going to hear about, is agroecology, which is a scientific discipline, kind of an interdisciplinary scientific discipline, in which a set of practices, and there's a social association with agroecology. And this, I think, is well described in some papers by Dumont in 2013 and 2018 and later. And this is another opportunity for rethinking management of animals on pastures. So in the US at least, well-managed grazing can enhance soil carbon sequestration, which is critical. We can use livestock to repair degraded landscapes, even if we were the ones who degraded the landscape. There are grazing strategies that can be used, and we can reduce the land conversion to cropland by using marginal lands, create biodiversity on our grasslands. We're going to hear a little bit about that later as well, and to have multifunctional landscapes. If well managed, I think it's possible. There was a couple of papers that I'm going to just go through here shortly, and these were published in 2016, and these are the data, the foundational data that were used in terms of gigatons of carbon per year, and then ran through some simulations. So you see that human-caused emissions here are valued at 13.57, and cattle emissions at 1.27 gigatons. So to kind of go through what would happen if adaptive grazing models were used, the authors went ahead and they created 5 scenarios. And the first scenario was the current status in the US with livestock production, farm erosion, fertilizer, and cropping, and that's that bar number 1. And you can see that that is a net positive greenhouse gas emissions. In scenario 2, they said, okay, well, we're going to get rid of half the animals. And you'll see that not much changed. We still had the same problems with erosion, the same problems with fertilizer and cropping, but the livestock portion of it decreased a little bit. In the third one, it was the same cropping, but they started adding regenerative agriculture, adaptive paddock management, regenerative agricultural kind of conservation grazing with current ruminants. And you can see that there's at least a beginning of that being starting to be carbon negative. When they went ahead and increased the propensity or the possibility of people using adaptive grazing, that with current numbers of animals, that increased as well. And then when they went ahead and they said, okay, we're going to use 100% of the population's going to use this with current numbers of ruminants, you can see that things became carbon negative. And primarily that is because there was a reduction in, or an enhancement in soil carbon, and a reduction in the use of other feedstuffs that would cause the whole thing to shift farther to carbon positive. When they did the same kind of analysis and they added as well, they added changes in cropping strategies, you can see that it became even more negative. So clearly this is a theoretical analysis, but what it does do is provide some data and some ideas that need to be discussed further in terms of how we manage with grazing and manage with cropping to enhance the soil carbon and change the type of diets and the plants that can be used by animals, and then create more of a carbon negative production system. Finally, I'd like to just briefly mention livestock water use. I'm not going to talk about it other than to say that there's green water, blue water. Green water is unsaturated. It comes from precipitation and is lost through evapotranspiration. Blue water is generally called groundwater or surface water, and then gray water is water that by humans in and out needs to be cleaned up before it can be used. And if you look at where livestock production systems are, as we discuss water use is fairly, I would say, fairly poorly defined in the livestock systems and needs some work in order to basically say, what kind of water are livestock systems using and how much water are they using. So this, there's a paper by Gerbens in 2013, and it very nicely lays out that the most important factors associated with water use is the feed conversion efficiency of the animals to be fed, and a better feed conversion efficiency decreases water use. The change in the footprint, whether it's blue water or gray water or green water by production system, and that's going to depend on the location where these are all grown. And the feed type and feed origin is also associated with what type of water is used. One thing to not forget, this is a complicated topic because there's pluses and minuses to everything, and we're going to hear about mitigation strategies and other strategies. And all of those strategies are important, but they can't all be used in all places. But as climate does change, we also need to factor in the fact that climate change has effects on livestock as well. And we can do all we can to enhance productivity, but we need to be aware that the climate is going to enhance productivity or affect productivity. And so as we design systems, I think we need to keep in mind both the direct and indirect impacts of a changing climate on the animal itself. So to wrap up, I think that, that we need to keep in mind the cultural uses of livestock and whether or not reducing livestock populations in one part of the world is actually going to make a change, a negative change in other parts of the world. We need to know what actually is used in an LCA or used by a livestock system and give the livestock credit for the things that we wouldn't be able to use if livestock didn't exist. We need to account for the fact that that globally, most of the beef consumed or the beef produced is produced with feedstuffs that humans cannot use. We need to really take a look at water use and what type of water we're talking about before we blame livestock for all sorts of water use that's not appropriate. And then finally, I would argue that there's a case for investing in the livestock sector, both in the developing or in the low income and moderate income countries, as well as in high income countries. And finally, I'll just end with a graphic that I really liked from Herrero et al., which talks about the essential elements that need to be taken into consideration as we transform our food systems. And that includes a lot of communication, a lot of social capital, building trust, et cetera. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Kristen. So now we open for discussion. So if you have some question, please move to the microphone in the room and ask your question. Is there some question? Yes. Give your name also before, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Professor Metu Wanapat from Konkan University, Thailand. I really very pleased to listen to Professor Kris Johnson this morning. I think it's really a great kickoff for the session that will be followed by numerous speakers this morning. I wish to express some comments concerning the issues that the roles of the livestock are overwhelming, especially in the developing countries. As reported that more than 70% of the people have been engaging in the livestock, and they are more than, the factors that have been reported, especially in terms of the well-being and the livelihood of the people that would need to be even more to enhance for their, for their perceptions and their implications. And with these, many incidents that affecting the malnutrition, and also the low requirement of the protein-based products that need to be, tackle even more and more significantly in the near future. So immediate actions are required essentially to empower the possible interventions to help the farmers in doing so. As the efficiency of production has been synchronizing with the reduction of the methane emission, I think it's the place that all stakeholders need to be really set up and go forward as we've been really calling for. And there are many possible strategies that you have mentioned. I think, and I agree that all of these cannot be tailored down to all locations. They need to be carefully tailored to fit the availability, the relevancy of the stakeholders. And moreover, is the sustainability of the stakeholders, especially the farmers, need to be immediately taken care of. And I'm sure that this session will be followed by many speakers that they will tailor and present to us that I think we're looking forward to more and more to the actions to be implemented. Thank you.
Thank you. So if you have some comment after this one, no?
No, I think that was terrific.
Can we have another question or comments from the audience? So you mentioned a lot of ecosystem services provided by livestock. I think that one is sometimes forgotten is that with livestock, we also produce fertilizer, and this kind of fertilizer can be used to produce crop for human food instead of mineral fertilizer. So livestock has also a role to spare emission from other sectors. And I think it's very important. At the same time, if we use fat from livestock to produce bioenergy, it's also a way to spare emission from other sectors. And I think we need to consider this as, it don't change the emission of livestock in itself, but it changes the vision we have of the product, especially meat.
Yeah, and I think if you went back to that study that White did in the United States, the reason that emissions went from 49 to 28 was because there had to be more fertilizer manufactured. And so making more urea fertilizer because there were no animals to produce animal-sourced fertilizer basically cut in half the savings in greenhouse gases that would have been seen from removing animals from the system.
Okay. Other question? No? Oh.
Don't be shy. I have another question for you, Kris. So you mentioned also a lot of the byproducts and residues that can be used to upcycle through the livestock sector. What about the byproducts from the animals themselves? What do you think, for example, leather? I mean, we mentioned energy, but other byproducts like leather or medicines, blood, and so on.
Yeah, I think that's true. That doesn't get incorporated into an LCA as well. The kind of bioproducts that probably can't be used, offal and some of those sorts of things could probably be put in an anaerobic digester. So there are opportunities to use that. The gray water associated with animal production also needs a fair bit of research to figure out how to recapture some of that.
Yes, please.
Hi there. Great talk, thank you. I'm Kris from CRV. It's nice to see defense or balance to the debate. A lot of individual producers are very small businesses around the world, and one of the big challenges is how policymakers influence them to make different decisions. And that's been a challenge, as we've seen in the Netherlands with regards to nitrogen. What do you advocate when it comes to changes in policy that influence those very small, often very unprofitable businesses to make different decisions when it comes to their environmental impact?
So that's an excellent question, and one I probably don't have a perfect answer for. I will tell you that we struggle with that, I think, everywhere. In the US, the big way they're going about things now is to create labeled, individually labeled foodstuffs so that I can buy a specific type from you and that you are, I don't know, you use less water or you produce less greenhouse gases or whatever, and some sort of a marketing method, but I'm not sure that that's necessarily all that effective as well. So yeah, I think that is a really large problem that needs to get addressed, and I don't know the answer. Maybe others have had success. You know, we have an extension system in the U.S., and I don't think we're any better at it in terms of getting people to change their behaviors than any other. But at least having the opportunity to present the opportunity, as he mentioned, to have technologies that could be available to somebody, I think is at least that is really important. But I'm sorry, I actually failed miserably at answering your question.
Okay, a very last question, please.
Suzanne Rowe. If we think about the actual impacts of climate change, and we're seeing that across the world at the moment, we're seeing temperatures change, which system do you think is most resilient? You know, if we look at crops, they can't move. So if you get a crop flooded, it's not going anywhere. You can move stock. If we think about, you know, when we look at the parameters that you've put before us, most of them are based on the agriculture that we know, with very productive animals and systems that we're familiar with, but that could all really be upended if we do see a 2-degree change in temperature.
Yeah, that's true. And again, I think that's going to be specific area by specific area. So I think that a lot of the principles that in terms of regenerative agriculture or sustainable intensification or the pieces of all of those kinds of systems need to be able to be pulled apart and put back together for a specific place, because it's quite a place-bound problem more than a global, you know, everybody should adopt an agroecology system, although that's the most flexible probably. But then there's some issues associated with that as well. So I think that it's a matter of taking the pieces from each one and having them be available to put on the ground in the place that it's needed.
Okay, so we'll close the discussion now because I think it's time to move to the next speaker, if we want.
Excuse me. Excuse me. I'm sorry, I'd just like to share this bit of the...
Just very quickly, please. Thank
you.
Yes,
I mean, it's a mutual effort that needed to be done to, you know, all efforts. Like, I just shared the example of the work that we've been trying to do in the region, that all stakeholders, from the researchers down to the developers, to help each other, to help the farmers. We have to transform the advanced technology in order to fit well into the region, in order to reduce or mitigate the methane through BCG, bioeconomy, okay, circular, and the green economy. All of this needed to be elaborated more and more in terms of possible implementations. Thank you.
Thank you. So this is my pleasure to introduce Dominik Wisser, Dr. Wisser, Livestock Policy Officer with the FAO and my former colleague. Dominik has about 20 years of experience in data analysis and modeling of natural systems applied to different domains, including water resources and climate change at different scales in Germany, in the UK, and now with the United Nations. And his presentation is about providing updates on baselines, projections, and mitigation options for the global livestock sector. Over to you, Dominik, for 30 minutes.
Yeah. Thank you, Anne, for this kind introduction, and good morning, everybody. I'm going to share with you some of our recent estimates of greenhouse gas emissions from livestock systems globally. I would also like to talk about some of the projections that we make for animal products and the implications for emissions associated with the increased production and some of the mitigation options. So the tool that we use at FAO, probably some of you know already, is called the Global Livestock Environmental Assessment Model, or GLEAM. And GLEAM uses a life cycle assessment approach that was already mentioned, which means we do not only look at the direct emissions that are associated with livestock, such as the enteric fermentation and manure management, But we also look into the upstream emissions related, for example, to the production of fertilizer, the energy used to produce fertilizer, pesticides, transport of fertilizer, and all other inputs for livestock production. And we also look at the emissions that are related to post-farm emissions, such as transport to primary processing and packaging. And this is where our system boundary ends, here at the place of primary processing. And I will come back to this a little later. And then in terms of gases, of course, we report the three main gases: methane, carbon dioxide, and nitrous oxide. So GLEAM was originally developed as an emission model, but now we want to expand it a bit and look into water use in this sector, look into more production and production value, economic analysis, and maybe other issues as well, such as nutrient cycling. So it is a life cycle analysis. As I mentioned, it's a spatial model. It operates at the pixel level, currently 10 by 10 kilometers, and it's a global coverage and is IPCC compliant and uses the IPCC Tier 2 approach, which means it has individual cohorts and dry matter intake for individual animals. We trace impacts from feed through trading. So when feed is produced in another country, we trace the impacts to the livestock producing countries, and we allocate emissions to meat, milk, or eggs based on protein content and economic considerations. What I would like quickly to mention is that current or typical greenhouse gas inventories typically use very different categories, such as this one here as an example, where we have energy, industry, and then agriculture, forestry, and land use as one broad category. And of course, our emissions are embedded in many of these other categories. For example, when we have a transport of feed item or a transport of animal products, that would be part of road transport. Chemicals, if it's related to fertilizer production, will be allocated to livestock. Emissions and others, you can easily imagine, will be also embedded to, or will be accounted for us in livestock emissions. So just for perspective, the IPCC categories are different from what we have in, for example, FAOSTAT for different activities, for emissions related to food systems, and you can map them. This is something that colleagues have done here. We can map IPCC categories to our FAO reporting, and the result is that we can allocate about 30% of all anthropogenic emissions to food systems. So this is important, I think, to keep in mind for perspective, also in the debate about changing diets, and I will come back to this. So what does the result look like now? As I've said, it's a global model, and here you see the total emissions at pixel level. It's not really important in terms of warming, where they are generated, but clearly you see the hotspots of ruminant density globally, with the dairy herd show in India showing up, some hotspots in North America, and then beef production in South America, and you see some of the European Union countries show up. When we look at emission intensity, which is just taking the emissions and dividing it by the total protein produced at this particular pixel, in terms of meat, milk, and eggs, we see a very different picture, where we have some of the highest emission intensities in areas where we have low absolute emissions, such as sub-Saharan Africa, and we have very low emission intensities, very efficient production systems in terms of emissions in, for example, North America and the European Union countries, as well as Australia and New Zealand. So we can look into this a bit more closely, and we can break down the emissions by species, by emission source, and by gases. And what you see here, this Sankey diagram shows you where emissions are generated. Clearly, most of the emissions, 62%, are associated with cattle emissions. This was already mentioned, 14 from pigs, chicken 9%, and then small ruminants less than 10%. By emission source, 50% are direct emissions, mostly, of course, enteric fermentation and, to a lesser extent, manure. If we add all emissions related to feed production, that's about 30%. And then in terms of gases, because enteric fermentation is so dominant as a source, 50% are generated in the form of methane, 30% as carbon dioxide, and the rest is N2O. And then the allocation that we do, you see that 2/3 of the emission are related to meat production, 30% related to milk, and the rest, very small fraction, to egg production. So this is an interesting summary, but also it was already mentioned we should look at relative emissions or emission intensity. And what you see here is the emission intensity, the box whisker plots for average country emission intensities, broken down by production system and by commodity and by species. And you see on top the emission intensity distribution for eggs, then you see in the middle for meat and on the bottom for milk. And clearly the red dot indicates the global average. Clearly this suggests it doesn't make much sense to compare production systems, but within production system you see clearly if some of the points that are above the red point, larger than the red point, move towards the global average, there's some potential, or there's a huge potential for improving efficiency. And of course there's local conditions that cause these differences, but certainly there's room to lower emission intensity. So we have previously published our results in various reports. Some regional aggregates were available on the website, and last year we have published our what we call GLEAM dashboard, which is an interactive online visualization and analysis tool, and you can find the website here. I would all invite you to have a look and explore this. You can really drill down to the nature of emission, produce some of the charts that I just presented, and understand emission and the origin by country and by species and production system. So when you go to the dashboard, this is the main page, and it shows you the summary of global emissions in 2015. This is our latest assessment, and you see the number is 6.2 gigatons. That represents 11.2% of all global emissions, and 3.6 of these are direct. So this is our latest assessment of greenhouse gas emission contribution to anthropogenic emissions globally. And I know that many of you would like to know how does this compare to the latest or the previous release, where we reported 14.5%. And does it mean that livestock emissions are going down? And the answer is we can't really tell, because many things have changed in the meantime. The method has changed, the data has changed, of course. But one of the important things that has changed is the way we convert non-CO2 gases to CO2 equivalents, and we use the GWP 100 from IPCC, and of course, reflecting advances in the understanding of warming impacts. IPCC has revised the GWP 100 values, and that's why the result is not really comparable. On the dashboard, there's actually a little tool where you can select a certain GWP combination, GWP value combination, and you can see immediately the impact this will have on the emission estimate. So we really don't know if emissions are going down or up from this assessment. And I think it's useful to have this global baseline assessment, but it was already mentioned that we need to produce more in the future, more animal protein. Demand is going up. And I think it's useful to put this in perspective and look into the future and see what the emissions will look like in the future when we produce this additional demand. So let's look into the future a little bit, and I think we can approximate this very easily. I have only two equations in the presentation, and of course we need to respond to increased demand by a corresponding production. That's very easy. globally, and what is demand is simply population times the average per capita demand. And then on production side, let's say we have some sort of animal number times protein takeoff that can produce this or generate this demand. So then if the herd size is proportional to emissions and we reduce the herd size, the only way we can keep demand, satisfy demand at country level, of course, is importing food, animal products. And I will come back to this later. But let's look at the individual components of this equation and start with population. That's the easiest, probably the easiest to predict. Here we are in 2020. We are about 7.8 billion people, and we are going to be close to 10 by 2050. And it's important to look into the growth rates you see on the lower right. All the growth rates will decline. Growth rates, not the growth of population, will decline after 2020. Some of the big countries in Asia have already peaked in population, and much of the additional growth will come from Africa. Africa will peak a bit later in the century. And it's also important to put this a little bit into perspective with previous decades, and keep in mind that we were only 2.5 billion people by 2050, and we've increased to close to 8 today. So the next question, of course, is how will per capita demand develop for meat, milk, and eggs? And at FAO, we have our own team to look into this kind of future projections. We took the projections for per capita demand increases from there. And you see that the difference between 2020 and 2050 for meat, milk, and eggs is actually relatively small. Per capita changes in per capita demand will be relatively small. What's also important to see here is that some of the continents, particularly Africa, come from very, very low level for intake of animal protein from meat, milk, eggs, compared to what we consume in Europe or, for example, North America. So we take this together, population times per capita demand, and this is the relative change in protein demand by 2050. And of course, some of the countries in Africa will see a doubling of demand for animal protein. Some regions will decline in terms of demand as a result of population growth, but most regions are between, let's say, 15 and 20% increase, and globally, the projection is that we need to produce 20% more animal protein by 2050 to meet the demand of the growing population. And as you've seen, most of it is driven by population growth rather than per capita demand changes. So let's look at this and also put it into perspective. This is the demand. So for the future, it's the projected demand, and for the past is the production of animal products that we have here merged into one figure. And what's important here, you see the growth, for example, in Asia, is very, very small compared to what we have achieved, let's say, in the last 30 years in Asia, in terms of production of animal products. Europe is going to be more or less flat. Africa, as we've seen, is a very strong increase, relative increase, but in terms of total demand is relatively slow because of the low per capita demand. So this is the demand projection, 20% more protein, and let's see what this means in terms of emissions in the future. When we start with the base year emissions that I mentioned, 6.2 gigatons for 2015, and we grow the herd according to these projections for animal demand, then we add an additional 2 gigatons, almost 3 gigatons to the current baseline estimate. So we would end up at close to 9 gigatons of emissions related to livestock by 2050. And of course, that's not acceptable because we have climate commitments and we want to reduce the emissions. So let's look at some of the options we have. The first option is, of course, we can reduce demand. And we can change the diets. There is a lot of misinformation about changing diets, including the, let's say, the naive idea to remove all animal consumption of animal food and then emissions will be zero, and ignoring the fact that we need to substitute some of the proteins. And what we did here to calculate this potential contribution of dietary changes to reduce emissions is we just looked into national dietary guidelines and recommendations, which for some countries include environmental considerations, but mostly it's a reflection of also cultural preferences and just nutritional guidelines. So then the interesting thing is that for many high-income countries, the consumption of animal products is actually higher than recommended, and the consumption of sugars and other things. So these countries, if they follow the guidelines, they would reduce their intake of animal products, whereas some of the low-income and middle-income countries would increase their consumption of animal products. And then the balance globally is between 3 and 5% reduction in animal or in demand for animal product. This is inspired by a study in PNAS from a few years ago. There's many extrapolation, but in general, the effect is much, much smaller than what most people, I guess, would expect from dietary changes. The next thing we can do is, of course, we can take advantage of the growth in productivity that is happening within the entire system. If you take, for example, FAOStat data and look at just the productivity per animal, you see in all regions, just looking at milk production is increasing at more than 1% per year. And there's none of the regions shows any sign of slowing down, even regions that have already high productivity. So we extrapolate this. This could save another close to 2 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalents. And of course, we can go beyond looking at individual animals, because we can improve the entire system from upstream to downstream and improve the efficiency from fertilizer production, fertilizer application to the productivity of the animal. The next thing we can do is, of course, we can improve feed because that has a direct impact on enteric fermentation, as we have already heard, and that would, in this assumption, add another 5%. Then, very briefly, rumen manipulation includes feed additives and vaccines. And I think there will be another talk about this, so I will be very brief. We estimate this can bring another 5% or 450 million tons. We have another option to reduce demand, and that is reducing food loss and waste, because what we don't waste, we don't have to produce in the first place. We estimate that 14% of food are lost globally. For animal products, it's a little lower, and in developing or low-income countries, the loss tends to be on the production side, partly resulting from inadequate cooling and slaughtering, whereas in high-income countries, waste on consumer level is more dominant because of impulse shopping and inadequate stock management. So that could bring another 5% if we reduce food loss and waste globally. We also have of course, healthier animals are more productive, and if we invest more in animal health and illness prevention, I think we can achieve another 10% of reduction. Genetic improvements is, I think, another talk this afternoon or later today. And I think this could have another huge impact on the on absolute and relative emissions. Circular economy was discussed very nicely in the previous talk, and this can help, of course, to bring down emissions further. And then, of course, we can improve all sorts of energy uses within the system, from improving the energy sources used to produce fertilizer, the energy used for road transportation, and many other sources of energy. And this can bring us down from the current emissions quite substantially. And you should not take these values at face value, and I will talk about some disclaimers in a minute, but this is just to illustrate some of the options that we can have, that we do have, to bring down emissions while producing more protein and while fulfilling the demand of a growing population. So this pathway, again, is an illustration, and there are huge uncertainties with these global values, but I think we can say that we have options to reduce emissions and to lower absolute and relative emissions. And of course, the pathways need to be specific. They need to be specific for countries and regions and production systems, and even for local conditions. But I think it's safe to say we have huge efficiency gaps that we can exploit within the entire production chain. And best practices for animal health will also increase production at the same time. And again, we have options to reduce absolute and relative emissions, I think. And here are some disclaimers, of course. For our assessment, we have already huge uncertainties in the global data sets for feed, for manure management systems, for herd parameters. And in the next release, we want to actually produce some uncertainty estimates and release them together with the data. And for the interventions, we have uncertainties in the size of the effect and the adoption rate. I think this is the big elephant in the room. We don't know how many farmers will adopt a certain intervention. We can say this will bring 30% reduction if all farmers use it. And I think we have a very limited understanding of the barriers to uptake and what are the issues that really prevent farmers from adopting. And I think part of the reasons, of course, is of course economic feasibility, and that's why we want to look into the economic analysis a bit more in future releases. And then related to this, we don't know what the scale of the effect really is. Some of the impacts are overlapping, of course. Some health interventions will increase productivity, and there are trade-offs with other goals that need to be considered. It's not enough to reduce emissions. We need to also look into the other benefits that livestock has that was mentioned in the previous talk. And what was also mentioned previously is that livestock systems will not only contribute to climate change, but also will be affected by by climate change. And here's a kind of a busy figure, but it shows some of the potential direct and indirect impacts from increased temperature, increased atmospheric CO2 concentration, and maybe more frequent floods and droughts. And there's a variety of different pathways where that affect livestock systems, starting from feed quality, feed availability, pests and diseases, certainly feed prices, but also labor availability, and direct impacts on animal health and production through, for example, heat stress. And we need to keep in mind this will be some of the impacts. They're very difficult to quantify globally, but it's something we need to keep in mind. Then the last thing that I would like to mention is the question of allocation. And that was already also touched in the previous talk. Previously, or currently, we end our assessment at the primary processing. But we know that trade of animal products is increasingly important. It's also important in the debate about some countries reducing their herd size, but then they need to import products. And the question is, how does this, what does it do to emissions? So the question is, why don't we allocate all emissions to the place of consumption, which is something we do in other sectors. For example, we allocate say, fuel emissions to France when we use the car in France and not to Saudi Arabia. So why don't we do it in the same way for animal products? So we did this little study here, this little exercise where we took the data from our own FAUSTAT and looked at the impacts for trade in dairy products. Dairy products are traded, expressed as milk equivalents, 18% traded globally. So mostly it's in the form of milk powder, but also cheese and other products. And we can use the trade matrix that we have from FAUSTAT, we convert it to milk equivalents, then use our emission factors that we have available at country level, and then calculate embedded emissions for this 18% that are traded. And this is the result. And maybe it's a bit hard to digest this figure, but basically it shows you subcontinental regions, FAO regions, and the trade in emissions, embedded emissions in dairy products. So 15% of the emissions in the dairy system would be allocated to a different country if we apply this, this little exercise. And you can see we have a lot of trade within Western Europe. This is at the bottom, where we trade dairy products within Western Europe. We also trade import dairy products from Northern Europe. Australia and New Zealand export quite a bit of dairy products, of course. And this little, I think this analysis is not, the point is not to say we should do this or the other one, but it's, I think, to inform the debate around traded livestock and the implications for emissions. And I think this is something we want to explore a bit further, the impacts really of trade that is going to increase for sure, and the implications on emissions. What we also want to do next with GLEAM is we want to improve the estimates of water use. There's also a lot of misinformation. We will have a report later this year about livestock water use and footprints. We want to include new species, and we continually, camels is on our agenda for the year of camelids that is coming next year. We continue to do data updates and then refine data on the interventions, including carbon sequestration. And like I said, we want to really be able to present an uncertainty estimate of all of these emission data. And we want to move to open data, open sourced application, and have a one-stop shop for livestock environmental interaction that goes beyond just greenhouse gas emissions. And the work that we do at FAO in general, we support countries with their greenhouse gas assessments from livestock systems with this tool. We build capacity, we share data, we have a huge collection of data of health parameters as well as the gridded livestock of the world, animal distribution. We help countries with mitigation assessment and the national determined contribution reports and the mitigation therein. And I think I stop here. Most of what I talked about will be in an upcoming report called Pathways Towards Lower Emissions, a Global Assessment of Greenhouse Gas Emissions and Mitigation Options from Livestock System. I think it will be out in October. So please have a look at our website if you're interested, and I would be happy to take some questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dominik, for this update. Fascinating story. And I'm sure we have many questions from the room on these new estimates from FAO. Please, Harry.
Harry Clark, New Zealand. Dominik, just a quick question on the overlapping bit. You had productivity increases, then you had breeding added to that and animal health added to that. But what proportion of the productivity was already breeding and animal health? And is there an element of triple counting in there?
Yes, there's an element. I don't think it's triple. Might be, yeah, I don't know.
But they seem to be additive, but
yes.
Reality, I'm not sure that they're additive in the way that it's done. So.
That's why I said there are overlaps, and some of the health improvements and some of the breeding improvements are part of the productivity. But still, I think, the figure is meant to illustrate the different options we have. And I think even if there's some double counting, we still have both productivity increase from all sorts of efficiency improvements in the system and on top of that, breeding.
And just on the issue of whether you have consumption or production accounting, unfortunately, it does work for other products as well. As a food exporting nation, we don't produce anything ourselves in terms of consumer goods, cars, etc. So we have to be very careful about opening that debate, I think.
No, it's not meant to. It's meant to inform. It's meant to provide the data. But some people have this idea: we reduce the herd size and import products from other countries, and then I think we need to look into what this means for emissions, because it doesn't matter where they're produced, and this kind of analysis can support, I think, the discussion. That's all.
Yes, please.
Nigel Scullin, Queen's University in Belfast. Really enjoyed your pictures going through the options for emissions reductions to 2050. The one area, and I think you alluded to it in your final slide, the concluding bit, was in around the options for sequestration. So I appreciate you're focused on emissions, but there's a lot of interest in agriculture and carbon storage, and particularly in the whole area of sequestration. And understand there's a lot of uncertainties, but a lot of optimism there in the sector at the moment.
Yes, there's a lot of uncertainty, optimism. We have a chapter in the report about carbon sequestration in livestock systems. It's just because in the literature there's such a wide range of global estimates that I didn't feel comfortable to put a number there. I mean, maybe I should have, because the others are uncertain as well. But in the report, we have a chapter on carbon sequestration as well.
Philippe?
Yes, Philippe Cheminot from WAAP. Thank you, Dominik, for your presentation. Regarding the pathways to lower emissions, do you have an idea of the interaction between the different pathways? For example, are rumen manipulation identical in animals which could be selected against methane emission, or is it included in your general view? Or
yeah, so I think that what I presented is a global view of the potential, and I think it's on the upper end of the possible impact because we don't know what the adoption is, and for rumen manipulation it's just some ballpark estimate, but again, these pathways need to be very specific and very local, and by production system.
So in fact, in your estimations, they are supposed to be additive.
Yes.
Yes, and not interacting negatively one with each other. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
While we're waiting, maybe I can ask you something, Dominik, about, you mentioned uncertainty and the sensitivity of the model to different parameters, especially milk yields, weights, and so on. So the data and the uncertainty on the data, what are you doing to improve that in the GREAM team? What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think the uncertainty assessment will be good for reporting, but it will also help us to identify where we need to look into. And what we want to do is really for each of the input data to have an uncertainty range and see how it propagates through the entire modeling. And then once we have this, I think we can improve the next release. But in terms of global data, I think it's obvious. It's herd parameters, feed and manure that we don't know really. And the IPCC parameters, I think they report an uncertainty range as well. So we could also propagate this through the system.
Yes, just a precision about your graph showing the expect reduction in 2050. Have you some map showing what are the main way of progress according to the region of the world? Because in your presentation, for example, it was quite surprising for us in Europe that changing our diet is a very small effect. But yeah, because we have a huge pressure to reduce meat consumption in our region. And probably progress in animal health is not so important for us compared to some African countries, for example.
Yeah, that's why I say these pathways need to be specific by region, by country, and by production system. And this is just a global overview. It's an illustration, really.
No, but it is important to have this kind of image in mind for to think the future. Another point we just discussed before, but it is that you mentioned that in your last evaluation, the emission of livestock sector doesn't change or increase a little bit compared to 10 years ago, but the proportion of emission due to livestock is reducing from 14 to 11%. It could be very important in terms of communication, for example. I'm sure that when you will publish your report, we will have a lot of media information on this.
Exactly. Yes, and I think we are prepared to explain the differences and why they cannot be directly compared.
Hi, Jonas van Dieke from ILVO in Belgium. Thank you for the very interesting presentation and lots of interesting figures. At a certain point you mentioned that production should follow demand, which is true, but what if demand also follows production? For instance, in your graph you show that productivity increase could reduce greenhouse gas emissions with, I think, 15% or something. But if productivity increases in countries where there's not that much meat consumption, maybe productivity increase will just increase meat consumption and not reduce greenhouse gas emissions in those countries. What's your comment on that?
I'm not sure I understood, but if demand follows production, then we have a nutrition problem, no?
Yeah, but for instance, in let's say, Asian, African countries, there's not that much consumption of animal products today. If productivity increases in those countries, then maybe consumption of animal products will increase, and then the greenhouse gas emissions coming from the diets will not be decreased, instead will be increased, I guess.
Yes, and I think this is, it's partly embedded in the way the per capita projections are computed is a partial equilibrium model, and I think some of this is embedded there because it will affect prices if production increases, and then through prices the demand will adjust, and so part of this mechanism is built in the projections.
I think there was a gentleman, and then you can go. We will take 2 more questions and then we break for coffee.
Hi, Kayo Wigertz from LFL Germany. Have you ever considered the future role of plant-based meat alternatives or cultured meat in your calculations?
Yes, we have a chapter in the report about about cell-based meat and plant-based alternatives. There's only 2 countries that have approved cell-based meat. There's some debate about the carbon footprint, and I think there's some recent publication that highlight that's really dependent on the energy consumption, and I don't think it's clear what the impact at scale is. If this is going to be a mass production, what the footprint will be. Because right now it's not a mass production. I think it will impact demand not so much by more through the discussion and consumer awareness rather than being an alternative itself, I think. And if you see the plant-based products, some of them are going out of business again. And in the dietary changes, there's, in the report we talk about how the substitution, if you substitute the animal protein, and mostly is monocultures of some oil crops, so that doesn't do much. I mean, it does something to emissions, but it has also a lot of negative impacts, and so the balance is not so clear.
So net effects are not as large as literature suggests?
Yeah, no, I don't think so.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, please.
Hi, Dominik. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. I'm Li Feng from China Chinese Academy of Agricultural Sciences, and for the data sharing, I just wondering how could we contribute or put our data into the GLIM models, because we done this research for maybe over 7 or 8 years to collect the missing emissions using the green feed or other techniques. So is there any specific requirement or something? Thank you.
For data sharing?
Yeah, data sharing.
Yeah, so right now it's, there's some things we have to do before we go online with all country data. But it will be done later this year or early next year. We will make everything publicly available.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just you collect the data from the publications also?
Yes.
Right, okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dominik. And now we're right on time to break for tea and coffee. So remember, it's not very close to here. So you have to go to Tête d'Or. Philippe is coming back. And remember, ground floor in France is 0 and first floor is 1.
Just to put the map. No, just to put the map where we have to go.
So we reconvene in half an hour at 11:10. Thank you.